Welcome to Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Canan, and we are broadcasting live on June 10th from the studios of WMNF in Tampa. More than 30 years ago, Florida voters amended the state's constitution to limit legislators' terms to 8 years. At a recent Tampa Tiger Bay Club, political leaders favored overturning term limits. This hour, we're going to hear that discussion. It includes former state legislators Bob Henriquez and Tom Lee, current state senator Darrell Rousson, and lobbyist Ron Pierce. All of them were in favor of abolishing term limits. Here, they tell us why, starting with Tom Lee.
Well, thank you all very much. It's terrific to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces. It's great to be back at Tiger Bay. So, first, I guess, when I think about this topic, I kind of had the privilege of serving in a pre-term limited legislature. When I joined the Senate in 1997, term limits hadn't kicked in, so I served with what I consider to be some of the most knowledgeable, deep-thinking members of the Florida legislature that I ever served with, and I don't think I would have been the member I became had it not been for my service with those individuals who subsequently left in 2000 and 2002 as term limits rolled in the Senate. So I kind of have a unique perspective. I also knew Phil Handy, who in 1992 was the champion of the term limits initiative here in Florida that ultimately got passed. I guess the way I would frame all of this, in my view, is when you look at legislative and constitutional changes, they're typically designed to address a problem that's perceived in our society or get out in front of one that's anticipated. That's why except for self-interest, that's why you pass legislation and change the Constitution. And so as we get into this, we can talk about sort of what the goals were of term limits and whether or not we've actually reached them. And I think that as I view it, it's sort of an incomplete thought. I think term limits had some laudable notions associated with it. We can drill into those as we get into questions. And I think the goals were laudable. And I think if I put up the goals on a PowerPoint, everybody would say I'm for those things conceptually. The question is, have we really achieved those objectives as a result of these constitutional changes? And I would argue that it's for that reason an incomplete thought, and we probably need some additional reforms if the original spirit and intent of the constitutional amendment is going to be reached. Thank you.
Darrell, you're up next.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here. But I have to start out by recognizing my former colleague, Senator Janet Cruz. Janet, thank you for your work. And then secondly, I need to apologize that I'm even here today. I should be in Tallahassee helping to prepare this budget as vice chairman of the Appropriations Committee in the Florida Senate, but yet we're taking a vacation in the middle of work. Before I was elected, I favored term limits, like many people did. But having served for the last 17 years in Tallahassee, I'm the longest sitting Democratic legislator in the Florida legislature. I've seen a lot happen. I've seen a lot of people go and come. And the downside is the experts become the staff, and to some extent the lobbyists, and to a larger extent not so much the legislator, him or herself. So I think it has its drawbacks. Fortunately, I served during a redistricting period, so I got a bump 2 years. So instead of 8, I'll serve 10 in the Florida Senate. So I look forward to your questions about term limits.
Well, first of all, thank you everyone for being here. I guess I'm somewhat responsible for coming up with a crazy idea. I guess I could win the Garfield myself by asking you, Darrell, do you think you wouldn't be here today if not for 25 years of term limits? I don't know. That's probably a question. I think, first of all, I'm really, really pleased that we have this particular panel. I don't know that we could have put together a group that could have spoken to this issue. And largely what we're doing is a retrospective today. We're not, I think we're all aware of the fact that it would be politically charged if any of us were to actually suggest that term limits should go away. But I think that to have folks like myself. The senator spoke to the fact I took office in 1998, so we were contemporaries from that standpoint. He had a chance to go back a few years later, so to see how the institution had changed a bit after term limits had taken effect. I will tell you, like him, I took the time when I was elected to meet with a lot of the so-called deans of the legislature. The folks have been there on both sides of the aisle. I can remember going down to the basement when they still smoked down there, Senator. So you remember that. On both sides, again, to really get an idea, because the institutional knowledge was vested in the members, and so I think this is a good topic. It's something we can just food for thought, and really and having Ron here, we have really the full spectrum of somebody who, as was spoken to, went from being a staff member. Now he's seeing the effects of term limits on the process. From one side of it, we have someone that's about to be termed out. We have a couple of old dogs that have a lot of the same scars. So I'm looking forward to the questions, and I appreciate everyone for being here today.
Good afternoon, everybody. So a couple things that have already been said. Number one, I think I bring a unique perspective because I spent 8 years in the process as a staffer. So I got to see it from inside the process, and I've spent nearly 20 years outside the process now on the lobbying side. I could not agree more with what Senator Roussan said earlier. What term limits has done without any debate is it has completely empowered senior staff and lobbyists, because we're the ones walking around with all the institutional knowledge, especially when it comes from a Tallahassee perspective. The other thing it's done is, and we can talk about this a little bit further, is because of term limits, we're now electing House and Senate leadership very, very early on in the process, and that has completely changed the process as well. I can tell you the next Senate president, the next speaker, all the way through 2031, 32. And sometimes that's good for the process, sometimes that can be bad for the process. So look forward to your questions, and look forward to the opportunity to share some thoughts with the panel up here. Thank you.
Well, that was Ron Pierce, Bob Henriquez, Darrell Roussan, and Tom Lee talking about term limits. And for the rest of the panel discussion, they were asked questions by the Tampa audience. So here we'll hear the next question or two and their responses. The first response we'll hear will be from Bob Henriquez. This is WMNF Tampa, Tuesday Cafe on 88.5 FM.
I'm Richard Stein. My question is, if this is really a democracy in this state, shouldn't the people be able to select their representatives without being prohibited of doing so by term limits?
I guess I'll go first. I mean, I think that's one of the arguments that originally back in 1992, that was the counter argument to passing the amendment, was that, and each of us, with the exception of Ron, I guess, have been subject to term limits, every time that we had to face elections. So that's the question. Don't term limits already exist in a democracy if folks have the opportunity to decide whether to throw the bum out every 2 or 4 years? Again, I think the counter argument to that would be that you want to have fresh faces, fresh ideas. I would submit to you that sometimes new ideas aren't necessarily the best ideas, and that new ideas, frankly, sometimes when you don't have folks that are really savvy and can see. I can tell you that in my experience, and again, going back to what Senator Lee spoke to, when I had a chance to speak with some of there was so much knowledge, so you could say on a big issue, to deal with really big issues, it takes time. And if you had somebody that could say back in 1990 we did this, 1994 we did this, whatever it may be, and understand that and be more contemplative and take time to really, the big issues, whether it be property insurance, now property taxes, those issues need folks that have experience and can be contemplative on these issues. And when you have a whole brand new group every couple of years, it's really difficult. And they're all looking to whatever the next big job is. It's tough for them to deal with those issues.
Yeah, I think that's sort of self-evident, yes. That in a democracy we should be able to elect our own individuals. I think one of the arguments that I think compelled the public to vote overwhelmingly for this in 1992 was the power of incumbency. And it is very, very difficult to find a partisan election at the state level where the individual who spends the most money loses. And so with the power of incumbency, the ability to do constituent work, integrate into the community, it's very hard to beat an incumbent, which is, I think, one of the reasons why Phil Handy and the 8 is Enough people felt like they wanted some fresh ideas, some fresh blood, and it wasn't a fair fight in the election process. Whether that's true or not, and whether or not we have actually created more competition in legislative seats, whether actually legislators are serving less time than they have traditionally over the years, is very debatable, because people didn't stay forever back in those days, just some did.
Thank you. I'm Ron Weaver, and I wonder if we could take a good and a bad example of how term limits changed the fate of Florida, the way at least one Speaker of the House who was not term limited on a procedural technicality kept Florida from being the 37th state to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, for example. What are some examples of a case where a young legislator, because of the pressure of term limits, went and got its act together, like maybe a Marco Rubio at the time, who went because of term limits and got his act together, the legislative basis for some meaningful action in the legislature? And then another example where without term limits, we got people who stayed too long, overstayed their welcome, and did not do us well with respect to staying too long in the legislature.
Well, not to monopolize, but rather than personalize it, I think that one of the unintended consequences, I think, of term limits is the extent to which it has changed the balance of power between the executive branch and the legislature. Back in the day, before term limits, legislators were not on a shot clock. They could wait out the executive branch. Their ideas could survive to beyond an existing governor. Now everyone's kind of leaving at the same time or has a short time in office. So I believe that the revolving door that has been created as a result of term limits flows through the executive branch, and many of the individuals looking for an exit strategy as they find themselves getting closer to term limits are bowing at the feet of the executive branch for the purposes of trying to find a place in the judiciary or in local government or an endorsement of some other higher office from the House or the Senate or whatever. I think that's really one of the most negative consequences of term limits.
The one thing I would add there is I think because of term limits as well, you're making, in some cases, budget decisions and more importantly, policy decisions based on a 2, 4, 6-year window. I'll give you a great example is from a budget standpoint, I mean, then Senate President Tom Lee had to actually create a constitutional amendment to have a 3-year financial outlook. So any budget decisions that were being made, you knew what the impact on the budget was versus, because if you didn't have term limits, you were, or if you had term limits, folks that were term limited, they were making decisions that were best for them in the short term, not necessarily how it's going to impact future legislatures 2, 4, or 6 years from now.
I will say this, and I can't speak necessarily to the time before I had the honor to serve, but one of the things that I found, though, and this is, I think, one of the results of term limits, and you mentioned, now Secretary of State Rubio, from a member standpoint, in terms of I think the best result and for the most member-driven of the process is when we've had speakers or presidents, and I will salute Senator Lee as well, who didn't necessarily have their own ambitions in mind when they were helping to, or then they were actually leading the various chambers. And I think, so for example, when Alan Bentz was there in my last term, he really didn't, he was very comfortable that after he finished, he was going to go back to building roads and doing other things. So it was a member-driven process. He cared about both sides of the aisle and all of the members and allowed us all to have our ideas and be successful. Not every decision that he was making was based on the fact that he had another thing in mind, whether it be higher office or something else. And I think that's one of the things that's happened as well, that the ambition curve, and all of us are ambitious. Listen, let's be honest, you wouldn't run for office if you didn't have an ego. But that ambition curve has really ramped up as a result of term limits.
That was Bob Henriquez.
I think
this is Darryl
term limits favors short-term incentives. In other words, big issues like transportation, like housing, don't lend themselves to an 8-year time frame. So when you come in, you've got to hit the ground running and try and get big policy stuff done in very short order.
Well, that's Daryl Roussan. Before that, we heard Bob Henriquez, Ron Pierce, and Tom Lee. They're answering questions from the Tampa Tiger Bay Club Forum recently about term limits in Florida. Let's hear more of that forum. Let's hear the next question. This is WMNF Tampa, 88.5 FM. This is Tuesday Cafe.
Good morning, Stephanie Pointer. I always look at this from the most basic level. Term limits in the city of Tampa just mean a rotating wheel, and we're going to have to deal with that with the next set of elections with our mayor. Why have term limits if you can just dance around it? But my question for all of you is, in order to pass on that institutional knowledge, there should be a test. You should be able to know what your job is. I see candidates come in here and other places, and they talk about the position that they're running for, and they have no clue what the job is. People who want to run for city council, and they've never watched a meeting. People who want Mr. Henriquez's job, and they have no clue. So I would like to know if you think it would be apropos to have a test for about the job before you can run for office.
Wow.
Yay. Okay. Who wants to tackle that first?
I'll volunteer to take the test.
Bob Henriquez.
So I'll give you an example, and Senator Lee will remember this, and so will Ron. So term limits kicked in the year 2000. If you remember, we had a little election thing go on in 2000, right? The whole hanging Chad stuff. And this is the truth. And I think there were 54 new members that were directly as a result of term limits and over 60 new members. I literally had somebody ask me where the bathroom was as we headed to the chamber when Speaker Feeney brought us into special session to create a new set of electors to help decide who was going to be the next president of the United States. Pretty lofty, big constitutional issues, and these folks didn't know where the bathroom was. That's, direct result of what was going on there. So you're absolutely right. But I will tell you, there's really no way that you can be completely prepared to be in the legislature, though. It's really drinking from a fire hose. I mean, you'll have the most disparate things. You'll have, a group of nuns in your office, and then a group of bikers, and then somebody that wants to talk about, economic development. It's a lot. So it would be a pretty expansive test.
Yeah, and I don't think you can do a test, but at the end of the day, look, when we're trying to go out, especially because of term limits, elect new elected officials, I think it comes down to how have they prepared themselves for that moment. That's the test, right? What have they done for the community? How have they been involved? Do they know, to your point, have they ever attended a city council meeting? Hopefully that comes out during the campaign process, because you're right. There are so many times you see people running for office, and they say they're going to do X, Y, and Z. They can't even do X, Y, and Z as a city council member or a county commissioner or sometimes as state legislators. So unfortunately can't do the test. I think it comes down more importantly is how are these folks preparing themselves by serving within their community to be an elected official.
And if I can just add on to that, I think the test is the election, right? So it depends on the nature if you have good candidates. And I'll argue, and I don't know if this has become a of term limits. I mean, we can try to figure that out and do some research. But I think that the fact that there are so many seats that are so safe that you're not necessarily getting the caliber of candidates or candidates that are maybe a little bit more, have their own sort of independent thought. When I served, and I say this. And this will take me a second to tell the story. He hates when I tell this, I think. I have 33 seconds. At the Tiger Bay, when I ran the first time in 1997, after we finished with the debate, Senator Tom Lee walked up to me, unsolicited, and said, "Hey, great job." It meant the world to me. I didn't know Senator Lee that well at that time, but I knew of him, and I respect him as I do today. And today, I'm not sure, and there were reporters and stuff around, he'll remember that. That probably wouldn't happen today because somebody would say, God forbid, that Republican senator went up to that potential Democratic House member and said something nice to them. That's got to stop. And I think that I think is something that, and Senator, I appreciate that.
I just want to do this for the entertainment value, honestly. I don't think we're trying to elect technocrats to the legislature. I don't think that's really the job. But it would be very entertaining to put some sort of test in front of sitting members of the legislature about something as simple as the budget that Senator Roussan is working on. I had two experiences with members when I was the appropriations chair. One wanted to meet general revenue. Okay. And the other was related to the Public Education Capital Outlay Program, when we were allocating money under that program to tail end. And I got their list, and it was their PICO list, which is what we call the Public Education Capital Outlay Program. But they spelled it PICO, as in the PICO sauce. They didn't even know what PICO was. They just knew they wanted the money.
And if I might add to that, I think the test should be, what is your passion and how strong are you at fulfilling that mission that you ran on? When I ran 17 years ago, I promised the voters that there would not be a stronger representative on the issues of substance use disorder and mental health than me. And in the 17 years, I've worked on various aspects of that passion and have been able to pass legislation, affect budget and policy issues along those lines. So the test ought to be the Strong Campbell or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory test.
To personalize this, I'd love to give them a test right now on property taxes, but that's a whole. But I don't know if I shouldn't go there, I guess. But I will tell you, I think this. I've been saying this: the three P's. There's politics, there's policy, and there's practicality. And if we focus more on the second two, I think we'd be better off. The politics, it depends. If all we focus on is the politics of it, then we're not going to make good decisions where everybody is equally disappointed in the policy-making realm.
That's Bob Enriquez. Before that, we heard Daryl Roussan, Tom Lee, and Ron Pierce. We're hearing a conversation about term limits in Florida. Right now, Florida does have 8-year term limits on the legislature, and some of these speakers were in favor of eliminating them, and you'll hear to what degree they're in favor of that and how practical they think that is as we go through the hour. This is WMNF Tampa, 88.5 FM. I'm Sean Canan, and we're bringing you this sound from a recent Tampa Tiger Bay Club meeting. Thanks so much to Chris Young for recording the program and for TBAE for technical help as well. Right now, we're going to hear the next question, and the first response will be from Tom Lee.
Hi, Kimberly Overman. In light of the desire to have people that actually know what they're doing when they get elected, I was curious about your opinion on how the impact of money and gerrymandering have actually addressed or impeded the effectiveness of term limits.
Well, campaign finance reform is what we really need. But, I think that would solve a lot of problems. As I said earlier, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who lost because they spent the most money. The courts have weighed in on that, and with Citizens United and other rulings, and money, it's a stretch to say this simply, but money is essentially speech, and so you can't limit people's First Amendment right to participate in campaigns. Now, Florida has a unique campaign finance system that takes that to a sort of a unique level at legislative races, but this has all been litigated, and the best thing you could do would be create unlimited campaign contributions, do away with political committees, and force everybody to take the money through their campaign and have to own those decisions to receive that money. I've talked to some of the greatest experts, Ben Ginsberg, who was the preeminent Republican expert on campaign finance reform. They've looked at this all over the country, and that was the best suggestion he could give me, and it was one we really didn't want to implement.
I think to your question, Commissioner, the effect that I think has happened, and I think this is a direct result of term limits, is that again, if you are looking to whatever your next landing place is, so if you're a House member in St. Pete or a portion of Senator Roussan's district, and he's termed out, you may have only been in the House for 2 years, or maybe you're at a local, elected official, and you're kind of looking, okay, that's where I want to be. You've got to go out and raise money, and so that's one thing. If you want to be in leadership, which ultimately, if you want to be a part of the real decision making, there's really 4 or 5 people who make all the decisions: the governor and Senate President, House, the Speaker of the House, and the next Speaker and the next President. Largely because they're running the political operations, so they're going to go out and give out the checks to the folks. It becomes difficult if you are ambitious and you want to run for this U.S. Senate, if you want to run for governor, if you want to run, and you can go down the line, to take on the big moneyed interests because you don't have the long play. You haven't been there. So I think back in the day, so to speak to somebody like a Jim King that we thought so much of, and some of the other deans of the legislature back when we took office, those folks, when that big moneyed interest came in, I don't care if it was somebody in the insurance realm, if it was the big ones, it could be utilities, whoever it may be. They could say, hey, I've been with you for 20 years on this, and this, but you're wrong on this, or we need to work on this. This isn't, and they couldn't threaten you and say, if you do that, you'll never be whatever you want to be next, or we'll primary you and knock you off next time. And I didn't say you're not saying this to them, but I think that's been a direct result, again, of that ambition curve and the fact that there's short-term ambition over long-term policy making, and the fact that there's so much money that it takes to put into that pack to get to that next landing spot.
I would argue that term limits has made the campaign process much more costly for everybody in this room. Bottom line is, because of new people having to come in, we have 30 or 40 new faces in Tallahassee every 2 years. Because of that, we have to go out and raise all this money for these folks to get elected. Some of the campaigns are competitive. Most are not. Some are competitive in the primary, and that's it. Ladies and gentlemen, if you go back and look at the last election cycle, the 24 election cycle, and I'll just talk about Tallahassee. Do you know how many millions of dollars was spent on House races and Senate races, Republicans and Democrats? And at the end of the day, do you know what happened? Senate came back at the exact same number. There was only one competitive race, Corey Simon's race in Tallahassee. Republicans held it. Republicans lost a seat, gained a seat on the House side. Okay? They came back with the exact same number. I mean, if you look at the maps at this point, I think Republicans have probably won statewide just about every possible race they could possibly win. But the thing that's changed over the years, and yes, I'm going to go over time for a second, is when I got in this process, House and Senate leadership, they had political committees. Today, everybody has political committees. Everybody does. So because of that, all of us in this room that are, that involved in the campaign process are having to go out and raise dollars for, House or Senate leadership for the Republicans or the Democrats. We're having to go out and raise money for the candidates, the PCs for the candidates. I mean, it's much more costly today than it ever was, and I think that's a direct correlation because of term limits.
Well, to add to what Ron was saying, the money tends to collaborate around leadership, particularly if you know that the next speaker is 5 years away. Then you start giving that person money now to build their leadership team and to build your access to them when they're in leadership. So it starts to coagulate.
Mimi?
I think I'm going to add this, Kim, real quick, because I think people find it interesting. I'm a business person at heart, and what Ron Pierce is saying is very true. To that end, and I think I can say this because it's been long enough the statute of limitations is run, but Les Miller was the minority leader when I was coming in as Senate President. He was a dear friend of mine, he and Gwen both, and we had lunch. And I told him, in a nice way, what he already knew. I was going to have 3 times the amount of money to spend in campaigns than he was. And we could go around the state finding opposition for each other in places we had no chance of winning and blow all of that money, or we could be pragmatic about it and for him to think about that. And at the end of the day, we had much fewer competitive races that were just an exercise in futility for either party. And I think that is really a really wise way to go about spending donors' money than to battle it out in places to make people's lives miserable in races you have no snowball's chance in hell of winning.
Well, that's Tom Lee. Before that, we heard Darrell Roussan, Ron Pierce, and Bob Enriquez talking about term limits. We're going to continue that conversation now with the next question. Again, you're listening to Tuesday Cafe on WMNF Tampa.
Mimi Osiason. First, I would like to point out that the League of Women Voters was against single-member districts when the issue was on the table, and those problems that Senator Rustin brought out were exactly the arguments that they used against them. I would like to ask, Mr. Henriquez, you said we couldn't do anything now. It wouldn't be possible. I would like to know what happened to leaders that we had that would stand up. You all are against it. Why can't we have leaders stand up and try to argue to the public it's time to repeal that? It was not a good decision.
Probably because of term limits. So again, I kid, but realistically, if you are in the legislature right now, it becomes difficult to take on those kinds of controversial issues because you don't want to marginalize yourself, and you're not sure if those folks that you're talking about these other leaders are going to have your back or not. There have been efforts to maybe look at, and the reality of it is, and as the senator spoke to, folks didn't stick around forever back in the day. There was a perception that there was, and there were some that did, and maybe there probably were some that were there too long. But really, the vast majority of people, 8 to 10 years on one side, maybe 6 to 8 on the other, they went on to do other things. There have been efforts to try to increase the term limit to a different number. I don't know what that sweet spot is, 12 years, 16 years. None of those have gone very far within the legislature. I think something to maybe modify it, to add some additional years, maybe some kind of a thing so it doesn't allow people to jump around quite as much, more at the local level. Those kinds of things we could do. So I apologize. I didn't mean that there's nothing that we can do. I will tell you the irony of all of this, Mimi, is that 1992 there was a citizens initiative to pass term limits. We just had the governor just signed something that makes it almost impossible for a citizens initiative to happen. And so if it's not going to happen from the legislature itself, it's some kind of a constitutional amendment, joint resolution. It would be very difficult for the citizens to go back now and unwind what was done back in 1992 because it's, and part of that I agree with, in the raising the threshold to 60, which it wasn't then 60%, although it passed somewhere around 60% as I remember. So that's what I mean. It'd be very difficult now because really I don't even know if we'll have any citizens initiatives going forward as a result of what's just happened. So that's sort of ironic.
Well, here's one idea that it's a long shot. It's been a long time since term limits passed, and we've got a lot of anecdotal experience with it. You're right. Ron Weaver will understand this, and the attorneys in the room, but there's severability provisions in every constitutional amendment and statute that get passed, just in case something in the legislation or constitutional amendment is considered unconstitutional, that the rest of it can survive. Back in the day, severability was very respected by the Supreme Court, which this was litigated in front of. Today, the Supreme Court has changed its view of severability in a case related to the transportation initiative here in Hillsborough County, and has basically ruled, among other things, that when major provisions of a constitutional amendment are stripped and then considered unconstitutional, the court can't presume how the public would have voted had that provision not originally been in the constitutional amendment, and they threw it out. Term limits originally included congressional term limits. That was the primary motivation behind it. And term limits for Congress people were ultimately ruled unconstitutional. It might be, long shot as it might be, there might be a mechanism through which the Supreme Court today might view the severability different and force that issue back on the ballot as a standalone issue for the legislature.
There you go, Ron. You're kind of retired. You could do this.
I need to give a shout out for single-member districts. It was Attorney Morris Milton, who was president of the NAACP in St. Petersburg, who filed the lawsuit to create single-member districts because we could not elect an African-American to the legislature from Tampa Bay. The courts granted his suit, and unfortunately he lost by 43 votes to Doug Tim Jamerson, who went on to serve a distinguished career. But it was because of single-member districts that Jim Hargret, Les Miller, Arthenia Joyner, and myself have been able to serve.
That was Darryl Roussan speaking at a forum about term limits, and you're listening to WMNF's Tuesday Cafe. Before Roussan, we heard Tom Lee, Bob Henriquez. We also heard from Ron Pierce. We're going to hear more from that forum. This was recorded at the Tampa Tiger Bay Club just a short time ago. Thanks so much to Chris Young for recording it. If you have thoughts about term limits, we're not taking calls today, but you can email me at dj@wmnf.org, or you can text 813-433-0885. Here's more of that forum. After we hear the question, we'll hear a response from Tom Lee and then the other panelists.
Gary Dalton, is another unintended consequence that the leadership, for example, a speaker is picked when they're a freshman You haven't even had an opportunity to see if they're a good legislator yet, and they're being picked. They're relatively probably a young person. Same thing with the Senate president, and as I think some of you alluded, the governor could just wait out the 2-year term that they're serving together. I was just thinking to myself, in Congress, what if they change the Speaker of the House and the leader every 2 years? That just seems crazy. Wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you.
Well, the simple answer is yes. That is an unintended and adverse consequences of term limits, is that these members haven't served together, have no experience with one another, and there's a ton of succession planning that can go on, but depending on the administration as they try to pick people to come into the legislature to follow in their footsteps to carry on some of the policy initiatives that they advanced as a presiding officer. I see all of that. I don't know what the solution to that is if you're going to have a term limited situation where everybody has a shot clock and they got to rise up through the ranks as quickly as possible. Frankly, it's turned the process into a pretty cutthroat institution because, as they always say in politics, if you want a friend, bring a dog. And that's really true this day in the legislature. It's become pretty cutthroat.
I will say this, that if the Senate had it right, they would have made Tom Lee the Senate president again, but that's just for me. I think that was shameless. I'm sorry, but what the heck. Now I have to go asking for a campaign contribution again someday. So I don't have. Well, I guess I do have a PAC. I need to get one. Help me out. Everybody else has one. To your question, it absolutely is the case. I mean, we've had Senate presidents and speakers that in the old days prior to term limits would never have sniffed leadership for many, many years later. Now there's again pluses and minuses to that. But the fact that folks that are just walking in fact, folks that are running, I can remember even on the other side of the aisle, folks that would ask me, when I was out talking to them, or they would come and ask for advice when they decided to run. Well, how do I get into leadership? I'm like, you get elected first, and so that is kind of it's an unintended consequence of term limits.
And today, it's sort of an unspoken rule that every class in the legislature, the class of 2024, the class of 2026, whoever comes in that class there will be a speaker or a Senate president. That's a really flawed way to pick a leader. And sometimes somebody that's been there and risen through the ranks and may have been there for 4 years or 6 years would be a lot better choice than somebody. But when there's a presumption that it's vested in the class of individuals that come in a given year, and that pool of individuals can be very small, particularly in the Senate, you really shrink the number of options available. And those handful of people have to get together and draw straws or whatever they do and figure out who's going to be the presiding officer. I really think it does shortchange the legislature.
I will say this, that we have a sort of unique situation. I guess we had a senator when you were back up there as well. The Senator Albritton, who is the Senate president right now, the last Senate president being Senator Pasadomo, is still there. And I have seen some positive synergy between the two of them, respectfully, on some major issues that have gone on where I think she's been allowed to take a leadership role on some issues and be more contemplative as a result of the fact that she's still there with a new Senate president having taken over. So that's probably a good thing.
That was
Thank
Bob
you,
Enriquez
my friends.
before that, Tom Lee.
Do term limits really matter anymore because of the way that we have gerrymandered districts? I mean, it's almost certain that in many seats, a Republican will be elected here, a Democrat will be elected there. And they typically, after 30 years of one-party ruling, that individual, that incoming freshman is following orders. Sometimes I feel like democracy is gone there as well, and it's more of a dictatorship unless you come across a Tom Lee or a Rouson or a Hernandez. Sorry, Bob. Enriquez that have a mind and are willing to take the repercussions. But I just don't think term limits matter anymore. In this seat, you're going to elect a Republican, and they're going to follow the Republican. I mean, we have become so vitriolic, and we are watching the news that we just want to watch without thinking we're voting an R or a D in a district that they're safe in. So do they really matter is my question to all of you. Thank you, Janet.
Ron, absolutely do, and I'm not saying this to get a couple extra meetings with Senator Rouson. It absolutely matters, Janet, because today, I think all of you would probably agree for the most part that Senator Darrell Rouson's done a really good job as a state senator in his district. As a senior member of the Senate, he has the ability to actually get things done through the appropriations process from a policy standpoint. What's going to happen in 2026? And it's a Democratic seat. We're going to elect a freshman Democrat to that seat. No disrespect to whoever's going to get elected. They are not going to have near the influence as Darrell Roussan does. Who does that hurt? The residents in Tampa Bay. So absolutely, I think term limits does have an impact when we're removing senior members from the process, and they don't have the ability to bring things back to their constituents, or more importantly, to the folks here in Tampa Bay.
Jen, I think to your point, in 1998, John Thrasher was the Speaker of the House my first 2 years. Tough, hard-nosed, ideological in certain areas. Last Speaker of the House for the last whatever number of years it's been. I don't want to count it because it reminds me how old I am. That served in the back rows. Had a great respect for the process, had a great respect for the process that all of us go through to get there, and treated the process, treated ourselves with respect, and every member was valued. On both sides of the aisle, that's not necessarily the case, even if you're in leadership right now, because you're not really valued. You're just told what to do, and you do it, or consequences. I will tell you this year is a little bit different, and those of us that kind of watch it like it's, reality TV are kind of enjoying all the crap that's going on right now up there. But I think that's sort of an anomaly for a lot of other reasons. But I think, as to Ron's point, absolutely.
I would just say, for those who may not, look, gerrymandering is not new. Both parties have done it, not just here in Florida, but all over the country. When you think about retaining power as a concept, there is no animal in the wild that has a stronger survival instinct than a politician. Not one. And they will stop at nothing to retain them. Now, they're doing it for an ideological purpose. They believe that their party being in power is essential to the furtherance of democracy, but at the heart of the matter is ambition and power. So gerrymandering's been around forever. It's not going away, except to the extent the courts ruled unconstitutional. Reason Republicans took over, and I've read this case, is because Democrats in the late 80s, Republicans in the late 80s, early 90s, built a coalition with minority African American and Hispanic Democrats to carve them out seats to ensure their election in minority access districts in exchange for the rest of the map looking very Republican. And before you knew it, you had a Republican-dominated legislature. That's what happened. It happened over gerrymandering. And so that's been around for a long time. I don't think it's going away, but it's not wrong that it exists.
And instead of having gerrymandering like we have, let me throw a novel concept out there. Maybe we should have it be 15 Democrats, 15 Republicans, and 10 independents in the Florida Senate, thereby causing a situation where each would have to go to the other in order to get a majority to get good policy passed.
Actually, I think another solution would have been the passage of Amendment 3 several years ago that created the jungle primaries, that would force the conversation to the political center so that you weren't speaking to your echo chamber in a primary, electing two people, and then a general election became the lesser of two evils. So I think there are solutions to this, but they're complicated.
Those are people talking at a forum about term limits. We just heard Tom Lee, and before that, Darrell Roussan, Bob Enriquez, and Ron Pierce. They were talking at a Tampa Tiger Bay Club recently, and thanks so much to Chris Young for recording it. We're going to hear more. The next question will come in, and then the first response to the next question is going to be from Ron Pierce. This is WMNF's Tuesday Cafe.
Hi, Richard Martin. There's some people that think that being a member of the Florida legislature is a part-time job. Is it? Should it be? And has term limits done anything to change that?
Importantly, I think it should be a full-time job. We're the third largest state in the union. We're making policy decisions. We're already in Tallahassee over 6 months out of the year. I mean, welcome to day 74 of the 2025 legislative session. We're going to be in Tallahassee through probably mid-June. We're going to have to deal with vetoes probably through July. Not only on the budget, but also dealing with vetoes from a policy standpoint. Then the legislature is going to be right back in Tallahassee for committee weeks in September, October, November, and December. And then we're right back into session next mid-January because it's an election year. So we're already basically a full-time legislature. Again, will that ever happen? No, because you would need a constitutional amendment to make us a full-time legislator, change the salaries and all that. That is never going to happen, but it is not a part-time job. In electing people to have the ability to have the time to be able to do that, I think is becoming more and more of a challenge.
And I'd like to add to that, thank God for Robert Rubenstein and the Rubenstein law firm. If you know somebody that's been involved in an accident.
Political advertisement.
It absolutely is not a part-time job. And for this $29,000 they pay us, I need to make sure the taxpayer gets its money's worth.
How'd you get that in there? That was smooth. Wasn't that smooth? So it sure as hell isn't a part-time job this year. I would just modify slightly what Ron said. I think that it is a part-time job. But for those who have the ability to make it a full-time job, they excel far, far greater because they have the time to travel the state, meet colleagues. The legislature is what you make of it. If you want to go up there and vote your conscience and do what you think is right, you can very easily do that in a simple fashion. Policy's complex, but you can do that pretty simply. It's all the ambition associated with trying to move up the ladder in the institution, build relationships to become the appropriations chair or the rules chair or the presiding officer, to parlay it into some run for the next office somewhere. I really don't think the job is that hard if you focus on what you're elected to do, which is really go up there and represent the people in your district and vote their conscience, not yours. But there's no question that this is a big state with a $120 billion budget. It's not as simple as it once was. And there really could be, if there was the will, a joint legislative commission put together to try to look at the construct of the legislature and determine, in a state as complex and as big as the one we have today, is this really the right way to organize 60 days out of the year? And do we need to go to a different model as we evolve and grow and become a more complex state? I really think that's warranted at this moment in history.
Well, that was Tom Lee. Before that, Darrell Roussan and Ron Pierce. Let's try to get to one more question before the end of the show. And after the question, the first response will be from Tom Lee. This is Tuesday Cafe on WMNF Tampa.
Vic DeMaio, former I guess it was president of this operation one time.
You were at one time.
I just want to say before I ask the question, I really admire the three politicians up there because, Bob, you've always reached across the aisle when you worked in Tallahassee. Senator Roussan is one of the most effective Democrats, I think, at this time and day. And Tom Lee, as a Democrat, I would go up because, in the old days, my dad supported your dad when he ran for office many years ago. And it's just sad the way politics has come this way, that you guys, were so effective because you reached across the aisle and the Democrat and Republican label wasn't as ugly as it is today. So my point is, the question is, do you really think that 12 as an option out there, since it is 8, and actually, by the way, to let everybody know, the 8 is enough thing that we have today for term limits was actually started by the Republican person because the Democrats were the vast majority in Tallahassee, and the only way we're going to shake this tree loose is to put term limits, and sure enough, it did work. Because Evan Martinez, your predecessor, was there for 25 years before Bob became the state rep. Do you think 12 years would be an effective option, and do you think that would even pass if it got on the ballot?
I personally, I kind of I think something like that might take some of the pressure off the internal politics of the institution and might improve the system. I also think you could do something like 16 years in the legislature. You want to serve 8 in the House and go to the Senate, that's fine. You want to serve 16 in the House and go back home, that's fine. But it gives them the ability to build some institutional knowledge and some depth and understanding of the public policy. If you had met the people that I served with initially when Bob and I were there originally, they had such great depth in the subject matter of the committees. Jim Hargret had chaired or vice chaired the Transportation Committee for a decade. You don't have any of that anymore. Unless you're a road builder, and going to the legislature, he's going to have forgotten more than that guy's going to know about transportation when he leaves. So I do think there's some benefit to rolling people in and out of the system, but it might be something that just focuses on a shot clock that encompasses the entire legislature instead of one institution, and they roll to the next one anyway.
No, I would agree. And again, as I spoke to before, I'm not sure what that sweet spot, if it's 12 or 16. I do like maybe that's what it is. You have 16 total, or 12 and 1. I don't know. Again, it's bringing that forward and again, it would probably have to be the legislature that would do that now, and whether or not they would or not, or would have the political will, to Mimi's point, or not, because I'm not sure that a citizens initiative has much of a chance of that happening anymore.
Well, the great Congressman Al Lawson told me one day that if you didn't like this session, just wait till the next. He also said that as a legislator, you're supposed to do 3 things once elected. The first is pass good policy, pass good laws that positively impact community and constituents. Well, when the numbers are 87 to 33 in the House and 28 to 12 in the Senate, it's hard to pass what your constituents believe is good policy. So the second thing you're supposed to do is stop bad policy, stop bad laws that negatively impact community and constituents. Well, when the numbers are 87 to 33 and 28 to 12 in the Senate, it's hard to stop bad policy. So if you can't stop bad policy and you can't create good policy, he said, learn the budget, because you can oftentimes speak policy through budgeting. And that's where I've parked myself these last 17 years.
Ron Pierce is coming up.
I think the only thing I would add is, in a perfect world, it'd be great to change term limits to 12 or 16 years. Absolutely. Be great to not have term limits altogether. I'd be 100% in favor of that. Challenge is this. Challenge is, if you try to change it to 12 or 16, how does it get on the ballot, number one? Citizens try to get on the ballot. We've changed some things in Tallahassee this year. I think it'll be a little bit more difficult for citizens initiatives in the future. That's number one. Number two is trying to have the legislature do something is to look self-serving. Yes, you can make it take effect after all the members are out, blah, blah, blah. You can do all those things. Here's the bigger question. Who in the world is going to try to educate the public on why we're trying to change term limits? That's a hard discussion, trying to explain to the general public on, if you're already unsatisfied with what's happening, potentially at the local level or at the state level, trying to explain to them, we're going to change it where the people that you already maybe have questions about can serve longer. That's a difficult conversation, and more importantly, who's going to pay for that? A statewide referendum to change term limits would cost millions upon millions of dollars. That's a lot of money, and I'm not sure who's ultimately be the ones responsible for crafting the message and paying, more importantly, to get that message out to the voters.
Well, that was Ron Pierce. Before that, we heard Bob Enriquez and Daryl Roussan and Tom Lee. They were talking about term limits at a recent Tampa Tiger Bay Club forum. Thanks so much to Chris Young for recording that, and for TBAE for their technical help. This has been WMNF's Tuesday Cafe. I'm Sean Canan. And I'm excited to make this announcement that beginning next week in this time slot at 10 o'clock on Tuesdays will be our brand new program called Making Connections, hosted by Patricia Alonso. You may have heard her last week during our fundraising show. She's a great host, and she'll bring you interesting topics every week. Also, beginning next Tuesday, we'll have a new 11 o'clock hour as well show at 11 a.m. The Big Gay Radio Show will be joining our daytime lineup. So exciting news next Tuesday. Hope you tune in. Coming up next, we're going to hear an episode of Alternative Radio. It features Chris Hedges and Gabor Mate talking about how Palestine is the moral issue of our time. Then at noon on Wide Awake America, host Nadine Smith speaks with Greg O'Lear about literature, tyranny, and the power of change. And at 1 o'clock is The Scoop, WMNF's 5-minute news summary of the day's headlines. In this time slot tomorrow is Midpoint. Shelley's guest tomorrow at 10 will be Pulitzer Prize winner Daniel Ruth. And I want to reiterate the top news story of the day. So far, Tampa City Council member Gwendolyn Henderson has died at the age of 60. The Tampa Bay Times and other outlets are reporting that Henderson died this week. She owned a bookstore called Black English, had a Master's of Education from St. Leo University, a bachelor's from FAMU. Well, this has been Tuesday Cafe coming to you live on June 10th, 2025 from the studios of WMNF Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota, Lakeland, Bradenton, and Clearwater. Thanks so much for listening to Community Radio. This is WMNF Tampa.